Welcome to Key Takeaways. I'm Maggie Bright, and I'm joined by Chuck Murphy and Sarah Marion today, and we're going to talk about wellness tech, where we are now, where we were in 2018, and where we think we're going to go in the future. Quick show of hands here, or maybe a number. I think I have owned 5 trackers, a Peloton, a mirror. Trying to go through the rest of these. Numerous food tracking apps. So I feel, heavily engaged in the category. Sarah and Chuck, do you want to give your litany of products owned?
I buy all this stuff. I had the Nike shoes that had the hole in the sole that you would stick the little thing in, right, and it would go to the watch. I was trying to think of I obviously did the Fitbits.
Yep.
I've had the Garmin watches. I've had the Apple watches. I'm less of a tinkerer with the apps, although I think I use a lot of
Yeah.
them.
And
But
and
some
we
people use more.
we can see your Peloton and your tonal in the
I
background.
have the tonal. I've bought
Yeah.
treadmill. I spend money on this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I'm a good consumer.
Yeah.
I
Sarah?
hold my load.
Well, you two are my early adopters. I am on the lower tech end, I guess. Although we have a Peloton and we have a smart treadmill. I had a Fitbit a long time ago, early Fitbit, but otherwise just apps.
Yeah.
I stopped even tracking my runs. Now I just run for a period of
That
time.
they don't count. They don't count if you don't track them.
Well, I don't know. There's only one, so there's really only one place to run near my house if I'm going outside. And I just, however far I get, that means I was faster that day.
Nice, nice. Well, the reason I ask, and I think we've already highlighted how vast this category is in terms of wellness tech and how many different entry points there are and sort of strategies or levels of engagement. And we wanted to talk about this today because our Q4 2022 State of Our Health report is coming out in the next couple of weeks, and it is all about wellness tech and what consumers are using and why they're using it, and if there's a big difference between those who are engaged in the category and those aren't. And so this is kind of a bit of a sneak peek of some of that data. And the other thing we wanted to do is we really did a little deep dive into this in 2018, just to kind of see where the market was. And we wanted to talk about sort of changes and really what that story is, lack of changes from the 2018 data to the 2022 data. And so, Sarah, I'm going to pitch up a big softball that you could probably talk about for 45 minutes. And I'm going to ask you to give me the 2-minute answer, but kind of what is the state of wellness tech right now among US consumers?
Well, it has grown since we last visited it in 2018, that's for sure. And I think some of that is natural growth, people coming to the category, but also we've seen a lot, especially qualitatively, a lot of people got Apple Watches, I think, between now and then, which make and those have come a long way in terms of tracking fitness. And we've seen a lot, even things like Fitbits. And there's this wealth of other wearables that have become a little bit more mainstream. They've gotten a lot more sophisticated in what they can do for a nice, reasonable price point. So the category has definitely grown in popularity. And it's also really this is a really vast world. I think that's important to remember. Where I think we could, for consumers, when you ask them what they think of are wearables and apps, but this can encompass all kinds of recovery products like Theraguns. It can encompass high-end services like cryotherapy, like all float tanks, like anything that relies on technology you could include in this category. But again, I think for consumers, that stuff feels a little bit far-fetched. So back to your original question, has grown, but who uses it is basically the same. So there's a strong kind of younger skew, but not down into the teen years. It's really youngish adults. And when you break it down by gender, it's about 50-50 in terms of tracking. But if you get a little bit more granular, what you see is that millennial and Gen X men are really the kind of leaders in this category. They're more likely to do all of the activities. They're more likely to own wearables and smart gym equipment. They're more likely to track more often compared to their female counterparts. And we can talk about that also for 45 minutes, but we won't for now. So back in 2018, what we found was that the kind of person who had a wearable was very passionate about being healthy, but also had all of these other kind of conflicting attitudes. They were more stressed. They also said that like taking care of my health feels like a chore. Again, this is compared to people who didn't track. And so one of our questions back then was, is this contributing to their stress? Does it make people feel worse about themselves? And I, just based on this last round of research, I think that the answer is no, but there's a type of personality that really gravitates toward things that can track their metrics and their biostats and what they do every day. And it's an A-type personality that is naturally kind of more stressed than others, that likes ticking boxes, that likes accomplishing goals. And that is the same. So in terms of attitudes, like none of those things have changed a whole lot since 2018.
Yeah. I think that I was talking to a friend about this weekend, and she's like, why do you need all that information? And I'm like, well, I just need to know, and I need to know what everyone else is doing. And she's like, that's just ridiculous. And I'm like, well, there it is. There's the difference. Like some personalities want all of this and some don't. And I mean, I'm definitely in the I want all of this information type A category, but I can see where some people probably don't want this. And it is a lot of information sometimes.
It's interesting too because there's I think there's a couple different buckets of why some people don't want this. Like one, you just have some people that are very, um, what's the right word for it? Just relaxed, and they're
I was
just
going to say serene. There's a serene group of people who don't need to track
yeah.
everything for
There's a serene, and they. But there's also like a group of people that like there's a little bit of denial there, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like a very if you're saying like, oh yeah, like I get my 10,000 steps, I don't need to measure it, but it's like, do you? Like, is that
Yeah.
it's like if you do want to change something, if you don't measure it, it's really hard to make sure you're actually changed it. Because I do think that is one of the. I mean, obviously, I became a researcher, so feedback is way more important to me than for 99% of the population, probably. So I'm probably an outlier, but it is interesting to me how even some of these basic behaviors, like I would be way off sometimes on what I would have said had I not measured.
sure,
Like,
absolutely.
and so it's interesting. But then the other thing too on this that Maggie, I know you and I have talked about a little bit is if you are a type A person, the measurement can cause like you to spin a little bit and go too deep in this, which is also not really healthy, right? And we see a big cultural backlash towards some of that stuff now.
Yeah,
Um,
Mm-hmm.
that
that
definitely came up
especially as
in
you
the
get close to
data.
food, people get really upset about it, um, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Sarah, or can I ask you one question? Not to, I know we have a tendency to ask Sarah too many questions, like she's memorized all this data.
It's
But
because she's a genius. She
yeah,
always knows the answer.
Well,
do
I do
you?
like to opine, so.
Uh, I know that you've looked at the state of our health data a lot from the perspective of gyms, and that's a big part of this. When you describe the audience for these, it does sound similar to me than the gyms, other than the maybe skewed more towards type A, but younger males would do you see these two audiences as the same, or do you think that like there's a divergence there where the tracker people are a little bit different than the gym people?
No, I think there is a lot of overlap, uh, especially now that because through the pandemic, the gym population got a lot younger too. So there's a lot of in that way you become more, because younger people are more likely to track, and if they're also more likely to go to the gym, you're going to see that overlap. But this is also a very engaged population. Those kind of people tend to be more likely to have gym memberships. Now, I will say there is an interesting little pocket of older folks who are really motivated by trackers too, which
Yeah,
Maggie and I were discussing this offline. Things like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch can be a really effective,
yeah,
what the healthcare people call an intervention for older folks. I'm talking like age 55 plus, because it really slots in neatly with their approach to fitness, which is just active through the day, primarily relying on walking. And so what we see is that when you look at boomers, boomer women are much more likely to have trackers than boomer men. They're like the tech adopters
Yep.
in their households. By much, I mean it's a significant number. We're still not talking sky high numbers, but because they like to get in their steps, very goal, like still the same personality, goal oriented. And a lot of times the goal is really high. Like we interviewed one woman whose goal was 16,000 steps at least, in addition to all these other things that she did. But for boomers in particular, the step tracking is very motivating to them because it gives them the benchmark that you talk about, and because they're less likely than younger folks to have these dedicated exercise periods, like an hour where I go to the gym. The tracker becomes basically the main metric of how much exercise they do.
Yeah, that's anecdotally, that is very much my experience. Like we live very close, to older family, and it's a good daily goal to have the steps, like,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people I know that are in that over, especially in the over 70 bracket, like they have a plan to get there, right? Like I'm gonna do 2,000 steps in the morning, like with the dog, and then I'm gonna take, like, it's very structured, and it's the same way. And walking's a big part of it, right? They might add in like yoga or something else, but it's a very effective behavioral intervention used that way, right? Like I think
Mm-hmm.
it's like, even go back to just the Fitbits, focus on one thing, like that really works well for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because it's a harder, that's the thing about the feedback that I kind of like, is that, if you focus on this 10,000 steps number, it's not an easy goal for a lot of people. Like it's more than they realize when they actually set about to do it consistently, right? It's like there are some days when you go over it, and I'm going to completely ignore Maggie's overstatement of her steps for this podcast. We'll get back to that
Oh
in
my
another minute.
goodness.
That'll be
That's
a supplementary YouTube video one day.
I don't know. I still think that they are correctly counted, and that just because I gesticulate a lot doesn't mean I'm still burning calories, even if it's not my legs.
Fidget
You're just
energy.
like arm walking. I just got 300 steps right there.
Yeah, we're
Um,
gonna have to have the Apple or Fitbit study the arm talkers, and how that skews their stats. We need like a weighting for arm talkers. Like, okay, we're
Yeah.
gonna discount your steps by 20%.
oh man, I don't know. It still counts. I'm moving. Anyway. So I feel like I have like 17 different directions I want to go. I feel like maybe I should throw a couple out and let you choose your own adventure. Here are the topics I'm intrigued by in this one. I would love to talk a little bit about the difference in what's out there on the fitness side of the equation versus the nutrition or food side of the equation. So that's one thing I want to talk about. And then I think you brought up a really great point earlier when Chuck was asking about sort of the overlap of the gym member and the wellness tech engaged either fitness or nutrition person. And I feel like there's this group of people that just keep popping up every time we talk about these little niches, whether it be online fitness or gym memberships or even within the space of formal diet plans and things like that. There's this core group, and a lot of times it's this younger millennial or the younger side of the Gen X cohort that just keeps, and it's male, that just keeps popping in everything we're doing. So we can table that for another conversation, but I do think that that's important, that it keeps coming up over and over again, that there's this group of consumers that's really driving the adaptation of a lot of these behaviors within the fitness and nutrition space, and they are definitely present in this wearable tech space too. And so I'll let you choose which path we pursue. Are we going to start with the nutrition versus fitness, or do we want to talk about kind of this super user that keeps popping up?
Let's do nutrition versus fitness, because I think that's a really interesting contrast. Partly in who uses them, but and then partly in function too. One of the things we found, which is not a surprise if you've ever used any of these apps, and I have used nutrition trackers, is that fitness has come a lot further than the food trackers have, because you can do it passively. So, and that makes it very easy. So that's part of the reason why use has picked up so much just in the past, 3 or 4 years. It's because, especially as that technology has gotten better, it's gotten easier, it's gotten cheaper. You can just look at it on your phone. It might not be the most accurate, but you can get a sense of how you're moving each day. More people have started tracking their fitness, and we see that in the data too. It's like far and away the main type of behavior. But nutrition, it's just so difficult to track nutrition in the same kind of objective way because it requires a lot of input on the part of the consumer. And so there's a lot of interest in nutrition tracking, but a lot less uptake, and I think a lot more overstatement in how often people do it because it's just so difficult to keep up with every day. And then it also, fitness, the downside of all of this tracking is that people say I get addicted to it. I get obsessed with the numbers. I'm in my phone all the time. I become that person I don't really want to be because I can't concentrate on anything else but making sure that I've put in my food. And that's much more the case with food than with fitness because, again, it's you have to take actual action to track your food intake. And it's also a lot easier if you've ever used any of those trackers. It's really difficult to tell if what you're putting in is even correct. And so it's easier to over or understate what you're eating, and it's up to you to decide how much it is, whether you're measuring or not, which most people are not. So
ironically,
it's very onerous for people, even those who really want to do it.
Well, and the healthier you eat, the harder it is, right? Because it doesn't come in a package with a barcode, and that's what simplifies a lot of the process is being able to scan the barcode and having it pop up in the app. If you physically have to type in recipes or, a food that's not in a box or a bag, it's hard. And then the other thing it promotes a lot of times is like, well, I'll just eat the same thing again and again because it's already, it's already in my tracker.
But the other thing is, I mean, psychologists have done this forever, right? Everyone used to do it on pen and paper. The fact that it's hard is part of the reason it works. Totally. It forces you to trade off. Do I want to put this dumb snack in my mouth and have to write it, or do I skip it? Like, it's kind of funny that's. But I do see your point that it is, when we're all wearing Apple's AR glasses in 2 years and the AI is just counting calories.
You can scan it. Yeah, I know that there were, at least a few years ago, there were multiple companies out there trying to develop a visual food scanning app. So like take a picture in that, and then it can estimate how many calories or whatever it is you want to measure. The other thing about these trackers is that like qualitatively, we heard a lot of interest. I'd love to track my food, but it's hard. And the return for me, because I'm already a relatively healthy eater, I already make sure I only eat at certain times of day or restricted in other ways, the return is not very high. And so when we would ask, if a friend comes to you and wants to really upgrade their health by using technology, what would you recommend? And so all these people who say, I can't use the food trackers, they're too much work, will then recommend a food tracker to somebody else because they assume that's the first step. You need to learn how to eat healthy. But once you already know, then it becomes much less worth it to do all that work. And additionally, the most popular food trackers like MyFitnessPal or Lose It are all about weight loss. You can't even put a weight gain goal in there. And so if you're already a fit person, frequently your goals are different. Like I need to know how to eat so I can train for the marathon, or I need to know how to eat so I can bulk up and, get the 6-pack abs that I want. And there aren't a whole lot of nutrition trackers out there that can reliably do that. So then again, they become much less worth it.
I was going to say my biggest barrier is that there's not a way to get the 6-pack ab to have that recommended. That is my biggest barrier to food tracking.
But a lot of your hardcore people, like they translate that into macro goals. Like, like if you're trying to gain weight, it's like, I want 240. And MyFitnessPal does that pretty well. Like if you break out your macros, it lets you set a goal towards those macros. It's actually interesting you bring that up. I'm always trying to lose weight, so I never even thought of it that way. But you can't say I want to gain 20 pounds the same way you would say I want to lose 20 pounds.
No, or at least the
That's I
last
never
time I
I've
tried it.
never even occurred to me to try that, to put it in that
You
way.
can go in and manipulate things because I've done this with the Lose It app where you can say like it'll if you want to maintain weight and then you can set like a calorie goal and then so it effectively does the same thing. So you can sort of like trick it into letting you do that.
Yeah, the assumed function is to lose weight though. And so that's what you get little rewards and badges for.
I think that brings up a really interesting broader point though, this idea that the trackers are moving into this more holistic way of thinking about health, right? So if you think about the ones that have come out most recently, and I'm sure there are others, but whether it be like the Aura Ring or Whoop, they're really a lot of them. They're focused on the sleep part of it, so on the recovery piece of that equation. And yes, they're tracking the activity part too, and you can um, there's a lot of metrics in there, but a lot of it is about the sleep piece of it. And that's kind of like the foundation of some of these things. And I do think that maybe that suggests, and our own trends are showing this too, that, it's not just about tracking the fitness or the nutrition, but it's more these consumers who are engaged in this category are more likely to be thinking holistically about health and are looking for more nuanced ways to track that. And I don't know, Sarah, if that tracks with the data set. I think it does. But we talked about this idea, and your trends are coming out very soon. And but there is one kind of around people are rethinking this whole idea of restriction or weight loss as a goal,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the trackers are trying to catch up with that to some extent. So, have
Yeah,
your thoughts on that?
it bears out in the data. If you're tracking your fitness, you're also very likely to be tracking mindfulness and nutrition all at the same time. Like these are what gets measured gets managed, right? That is kind of the mantra of the tracker, I think, and that can extend into all parts of life. The sleep tracking is really interesting because consumers are very interested in it. They want to know that information. They know that sleep is important. And so many people struggle with sleep. But what we heard, particularly qualitatively, was a lot of confusion about what do I even do with this data. I look at it every day and it gives me a score. And is that how I really slept, or am I just like responding to the number? And then if it's bad, what do I do about it? Like it's very difficult to know how to take action
Well,
when you see
I
all this sleep data in front of you.
there are the super early adopter slash rich crowd is really into that 8 sleep mattress, precisely because it's not just a number, but then it's making changes behind. I do think that that's the future of a lot of this stuff, like um where you have the tracking component, which we've had for a long time, right? You could do the tracking
Yeah.
component forever, but then you have some intervention that is, I like the way Sarah put it. It's more passive, right? It's less like that.
Mm-hmm.
I've never had one of those 8 sleep mattresses, but I've read different people's reviews of how they work, and there's like a little AI algorithm back there tinkering with. I think it's all temperature is what it's doing. I'm not sure if it changes any positions, but it's tinkering with different temperatures and trying to keep you asleep longer, which is kind of like dystopian, but also kind of rad. Um,
What takes it
it's
out of your hands?
it takes it out of your hands. Yeah, there's and I think there's gonna like that kind of stuff is super interesting to me, because I do think there is an opportunity here. There's a lot of opportunities for the interventions to get better, and I still think a lot of that stuff is very early stage.
Yeah. Well, I
Um,
think we've moved from this idea of tracking, right, which is like the early Fitbits, right, where it just basically said like you did 10,000 steps, way to go. And now, if in the newer trackers and even the newer versions of the Fitbit or the Apple Watch, it's a little bit more customized. So it is responding in some way to the data that's going into it, right? It's recommending adjusted calorie outputs, or it's telling you, you should go to bed at this time, or you know you shouldn't exercise this late in the day, kind of stuff. So we're starting to get some feedback, but it is still on the owner or wearer of that device to actually enact the change. And then I think you're right, Chuck, where it's headed next is it your devices or your tech, the things that you own, start to make the adjustments for you, so it becomes passive behavioral changes. I don't know how that it obviously can't exercise for you and things like that. So I don't, we'll see where that goes from the fitness side of the things. But even if, something like, I don't own a tonal, but I assume that it adjusts to, the stronger you get, the more likely it's to recommend different stuff or to adjust, in
Yeah,
weight.
it's funny. I have two products. One is the tonal, and then I have this other thing that I guarantee you neither have ever heard of. That's a golf thing, but both of them have the same basic thing, which I think is very interesting. In that, like, they have taken the decision away from you in
Mm,
terms of what you're so you have, yes, you have to commit to doing the workout, you have to
right.
start the workout, right? But like when
Yeah.
you hit start workout on tonal, even if you think about Peloton, right, I've got the knob on the bike and I'm choosing. There are some days when I'm really pushing myself and I'm turning that knob up, and there are other days where I've got that thing 20% off what I could be doing just because I'm feeling a little bit
Yeah.
lazy. But it's very interesting that the in the tonal, like, it's not giving me the choice. I choose what the workout is, right? I could say, okay, I want to do it, you know a lower body or a core workout, but I'm not choosing the weight or the reps. And I think that kind of stuff is really interesting. I mean, that's what I was saying about the 8 sleep, is because
Mhm.
this it's very you obviously this is why people went to personal trainer or still go to personal trainer so much, right?
Yeah.
It's tell me what to do. I'm not going to take the time to become an expert on what
Right.
makes me sleep better. Tell me what to do, tell me your ideas. Some of them might work, some of them won't. And on the tonal, it took me a while to get used to that, actually, because it's still an early stage product, which is it's got some problems in the sense that it would be too aggressive sometimes. Like I tore my rotator cuff, and then I was recovering from that. And I'm like, hey, stop. Because it won't just, one rep might be at like 30 pounds, and then you go to the next rep and it ups it to 50 just as like a random test of you, which is a little bit like, I'm like, hey, that's aggressive, man.
Mm.
Like I'm kind of like, there are times when it's still learning, but the idea that it's um, taking over at least the recommendation of you can always override it. You can always lower the
Right.
weight. But it's interesting. I think that there's a lot to be said for that, because people tend to fall back into routines, especially with things like fitness, right? And that's one of the things that personal trainers harp on, right? Is like, your body can get used to anything. You've got to switch it up to keep it learning. And so the fact that you've got this kind of algorithm back there switching it up and trying to figure out and everybody's different. Some people might respond better to X or Y. And so it's interesting as we'll see more of that. I mean, uh,
Well, it speaks to this idea that there's no one size fits all for fitness or nutrition when it comes to sort of optimizing each person.
Right.
Which before we had limited tools for, right? You could go to the
Yeah.
personal trainer, you yourself could do a ton of research and trial and error. And now our tools are getting more and more sophisticated, so it's cutting out a lot of the thought process, which is great because it's overwhelming, all the information that's out there, and there continues to be more and more and more information. Um, which is cool. And I was just trying to think as you said all that. I'm like, have I actually? So I just got my Aura ring, which I really like, and I will say I have literally tried every single wearable out there, um, with the exception of I have not tried the Garmin one, and I have not tried. Actually, that's probably it. But so I've tried them all, and I will say I think each one. Oops, I think each one is like I keep they keep evolving each one I buy, right? And obviously, if I went back and bought the same ones that I had early now, I think they would have evolved too. But I do think some of the, like, I do think I've changed my sleep behavior because of the
Mm.
information I've gotten from this and from the Whoop. I think I try to go to bed more consistently. I think, there's certain things I do, um, in sort of like, I have more of a like pre bed routine now than I ever had because of feedback it's given me. So I do think if you are willing to take in all the information, you can very much change behaviors based on, passive data that isn't necessarily making direct recommendations about what you should do. But I would love it if it just put me to sleep at the time I needed to go to bed and then woke me up when I was ready.
do you want Michael Jackson's doctor to come help you out?
No, I
That may not be a safe for work joke.
no,
Um,
I don't think so.
by the way, it's funny. I've always been like a little bit of an Apple fanboy, but I am kind of astounded by how much progress that Apple Watch has made I think it's like 7 years old or whatever it is now. Um, and I think a lot of people kind of take it for granted, but it is interesting that every couple of years they're adding these kind of major things. Like, I have a couple of friends now that
Mhm.
have had that heart function um, really be a big deal to them. You know what I mean? Like, and send them to the
Yeah.
emergency room, and it's a really crazy thing. And I'm really interested in when they integrate the glucose monitoring in it, because that's something else that when you get into, if you really go deep into nutrition, by the way, we should say when we go back to these apps, nutrition is so friggin' complicated, right? Like, I
Yeah.
feel like I'm like a person that I love to go deep on things and try to learn things, and I feel like I'm decent at figuring things out. And nutrition is just such a crazy world of, like, there's so many factors you can't control. There's so many things to know.
Mm-hmm.
And they interplay with each other, and it's like I could see how people just throw their hands up because, like, I'm constantly be told something different, like, to do,
Yeah.
like, and most people still don't have a solid consensus on, like, hey, is a lot of protein good for your body? Is, like, or like, there's a lot of questions out there that are still, anyhow. But I do think it'll be fascinating if they can get, like, the insulin stuff just passively on your wrist, being like, hey, by the way, every time you eat that granola bar that you think is healthy, you're getting an insulin spike, and it's setting you back. And it'll be kind of wild 10 years from now, like, how much feedback you might be able to get just off your wrist. You know what I mean? Like, in a
And I think that has to be the next iteration, right? Because tech or the fitness is already going there, right? By giving you this like more in the moment feedback about how the activities we do impact, whether it be overall fitness level or ability to rest and recover. And so it makes sense that we would get to a place where our nutrition is passively tracked in that same way, and we're getting constant customized inputs about the things that we eat and how they're impacting sort of not only our long-term health but our like moment to moment health. Like that has to be the next step, and I would imagine everyone's working on that already, but it's harder to do, right? I mean, it's easier to track things like your heart rate and the variability and relate that to fitness and recovery versus glucose levels and things like that.
The
So,
continuous glucose monitor and things like the sweat patch, which isn't exactly, that has a very specific purpose, but the glucose monitor is kind of the closest I think that we've come to that passive nutrition tracking. And it's not exactly nutrition, right? It's metabolism. The other one that one of our respondents keyed me into it's called Lumen. I think it's basically a breathalyzer.
right,
But
there's limit, and
it
there's also
analyzes your
levels.
metabolism through your CO2 output.
Yeah, there's also levels too, which,
Okay.
levels IO or whatever, which, but it's the crowd, the early adopter kind of crazy slash rich people, that are buying the 8 Sleep mattress are all doing those patches too. That obviously started as a clinical tool for diabetics, but people have kind of, it's very. I've read a lot of reviews of this stuff just because I think that is one thing that, like, a couple years ago I didn't understand at all. Like, I was like, oh, like, that's really interesting that the order that you eat things in can impact how your body processes them. Like, it's a really wild. This is where nutrition is complicated, but that stuff is really interesting, and a lot of people are coming at it. I do think that it's I some of the I've looked into this a little too much, but it's hard to get it. It's a little bit like what Apple went through with the heart rate, right? It's very easy to measure heart rate and be 85-90% accurate. That last 10 or 15% where it's working correctly, you can't give a bad read, right? So I feel like that's kind of where they are right now with the glucose stuff. Is like, they can get it for most people most of the time, but they're trying to make it more reliable and safe to put out there on millions of people's wrists, which it's a fascinating area, though.
yeah, I feel like that is, next on our purchase list, Chuck, whenever it comes out.
I
Add
try
that
to convince myself that I'm never in the early adopter crowd. I try to wait, but I'm usually probably wrong on that.
I feel like I'm in the late end of the early adopter on wearables, but on everything else, no, I am definitely not an early adopter.
I feel I've thought about this a lot because I think about health and wellness a lot. There's these like three competing approaches that most people combine in some way. There's this intuitive approach, which is about how I feel and like listening to my body and my mood. And then there's the rational approach, which is the measurement. And the people who track are like very firmly in this rational camp. They want to measure everything. But a lot of people are very interested in, they combine the intuitive and the rational, right? because the sweet spot is to be kind of in the middle. And then the third approach is to back away from it completely. The kind of, it's not exactly rejector, but there are times when you could call it rest and recovery. But there's times when you don't want to measure or be intuitive necessarily. You need to back away and take care of yourself in a different way. You could call it having fun. There's pathologies related with all three of those areas, right? But ideally, you're somewhere in the middle where you're kind of rational about when you're being intuitive, and you're rational about when you're backing away and taking a rest. And you're not too far into the rational, so you're getting crazy about it. It's just so hard to stay in that place with all of these things, because much like you can go deep in any of these areas, but as wellness also expands to encompass, like, oh, now I have to think about my sleep. Now I have to think about how often I'm resting and recovering and what that looks like. And is it active and is it passive? And does this count? It, like nutrition, it becomes really overwhelming. And I think the tracking is a way to get a handle on all of that stuff. But at the same time, the more inputs that you're, putting in, the more you have to think about and make decisions about and manage. Hence, you get our stressed out trackers.
Right? I love it. I mean, I don't love it, but I agree with it. I do think that's why some of the trackers that don't have displays are like, that allows you to balance a little bit more the rational and the intuitive approach, right? So if you have, the Apple Watch, you can look at what's going on all the time. Like you see your rings on your wrist and you know what's happening. And I think, but with something like the Whoop or the Oura Ring, like you actively have to go look in the app. You have to get on your phone, look in the app to see what's happening. And so like that's how I balance the intuitive and the rational, right? Because if I were constantly looking at what my scores were all the time, and I did with my Apple Watch for years, and I love my Apple Watch. I still rotate it through my wearable rotation. But I get even more fixated on it when I can like see it on my wrist and what my progress is. So I do think that there's, even within these wearables, there's a way to balance those mindsets. And then you can always forget to charge it, and then you go into the backing away phase.
Yep.
Well, I know we've hit on a lot of topics, and we did it in a fairly concise manner for us. Sarah, is there any sort of, I know the report's coming out in a few weeks for our State of Our Health subscribers. Any other big, without spoiling anything, any other big takeaways that we're going to hit on? Right?
No, we've had a lot of the highlights, I think. One of the things that is really interesting to me about this category is the bridges and barriers. So what really solves a problem? What creates more problems? And I think one of the things that we've found with fitness versus nutrition is that the fitness trackers really do kind of solve many problems that people had, especially people that are already pretty engaged with fitness. They wanted an objective benchmark. They want to be able to progress. They don't take a set it and forget it approach anyway. And so this helps them, maintain that goal orientation. Whereas the nutrition trackers don't solve problems that people who are already healthy eaters have, for instance. They solve other problems that, but the kind of people who track their fitness tend to already be engaged in nutrition. So they're looking for something, perhaps one step up or with more personalizable goals that is a little bit more difficult to find right now. One thing that we didn't talk about is there's this expanding world of like personalized nutrition services that gets into your DNA and vitamin packs.
Yeah, we didn't talk about the DNA stuff. That stuff is fascinating. There's in food, it's funny. You could do hours and hours on personalization of food, and I think some of these companies are super interesting. The other thing we didn't talk about, and maybe this is like a future podcast because I think we could spend a lot of time on this, but I am fascinated by the merger, kind of like when we started this podcast, when you talk about the audience for a lot of this fitness tracking stuff, and then you talk about the audience for in person. And you see some of these younger scaling gyms incorporating not necessarily with technology. Let's put it to technology, but
Yeah.
you can see those things coming together. Like I can imagine like a world where uh, someone does a really good job of this. Like, and yeah, and you see some experimentation with a lot of young fitness chains in this now. But I think that it's going to be there's a huge opportunity there for someone to do a really good job of integrating um, what you can do at home. The first thing that
Yeah.
comes to mind, and this is a super small example, but like if you happen to live in New York, it's pretty rad that you could go to the Peloton studio, do your workout there, still have all your data in the app still being on whatever program you're on, um, still have the instructors and everything, but then also do it at home. That kind of like at home and then in person combo, I think is I know a lot of people are really trying that, but I think I think it's still very early. But
Yeah,
it's
I
fascinating.
agree. Because this kind of, again, this is like there's this one particular kind of consumer that has the tracker and they go to the gym and it's a nice gym and they maybe go to a studio for some other specialized class and they have the Peloton at home. This is actually my husband. But and they have
There's
the
the
watch
fourth
and they have
person.
all the apps.
Yep.
um, and just very engaged in that whole world. And part of the reason that I think that the tracking apps in particular have become so popular is because you can take them everywhere you're going. And so all of your data gets captured no matter where you are. Because if you go to a gym, you see people, they're doing classes on their phone, they're following tips on their phone, they're doing a program set by an app on the phone. And then some of our gym clients have said, well, is it worth investing in smart equipment at the gym if nobody uses it? If they just get on and hit quick start and then use their phone instead? Um,
Well, the gyms I think are probably really scarred by how many failed integrations there's been at this.
yeah.
Like it's a really tough position because it's so expensive. It always amazes me how many gyms you go to that they can't even keep the TV part of the fitness
Mhm.
equipment working, much less the part where you could plug in an iPod or you could, there's been so
Right.
many integrations that haven't worked, which is that's the thing is like you really if you deploy a ton of capital in all these locations and you try to do some integration and then all of a sudden something new comes along 5 years later, you're really in a tough spot, which is it's a hard business to launch, right?
Mhm.
Which is probably why it'll probably be like a yoga or a equipment light version that gets this first. Like I know I've talked about this before in the past, but somebody's going to get this with mindfulness. I think something you could do either in a physical space or in your home, some combination of I don't know. There's a lot there that's I think it's interesting because it's so early stage. Um,
Yeah, there's a lot of runway, I think, to figure out how this works, in terms of sort of pulling together all the pieces that may exist now into one sort of cohesive experience. And it's funny, I do think preferences are different. I mean, just what I would want that would be sort of this integrated experience probably looks really different than what the two of you want. And I think that's the struggle that companies have, is to figure out, because if you go to the lowest common denominator, it might please no one. But if you get it too customized, then you have too niche of an audience for it. And so I think that's the big challenge here, is what's sort of what are kind of the big pieces you can pick up first and then take people along the journey so that you can slowly change preferences so they're more sort of universal across consumer groups. Because especially within nutrition, right? Because your nutritional needs are so customized by person. And so how would you ever design something that sort of fits all of those if you're going for a custom approach? And I think that's the big challenge, is like, how do you thread the needle between it being super customized and personal to being marketable at a more mass level? It's my 2 cents. Well, thank you both. I always love chatting with you, no matter what the topic is. And I feel like we will probably revisit this one sometime in the next 12 to 18 months, and we'll all have something new that we've purchased and have, seamlessly integrated into our lives. So we
Yes,
can
what
talk
new
again.
device will there be?
Exactly. I don't know. I don't, when I don't know. So my big thing right now, and Sarah had to witness some of this yesterday, is I'm doing all of this testing right now to get sort of like what my cellular level metabolic processes are. And so then I can like customize things, whether it be food or sleep or whatever, on a very granular level. So that's my new big thing. I'll let y'all know how that goes. I've got like 7 million tests that I've been taking over the last few weeks.
So you're a cellular superhero. We already know that.
No, I think I'm not.
You might
And
be
that's
a
the
cellular
problem.
superhero.
I'm going to find out that I'm stressed. And then they're going to be like, so fix your stress. And I'm like, where's the app for that?